What do you do when you're 9 years old, you pray for your mother to live, and she dies anyway? Well, if you're C.S. Lewis, you decide that God doesn't exist. You become an atheist for most of your adult life. And then, about 40-ish years later, you write a novel about a boy in your exact situation. That novel is The Magician's Nephew, the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia, and it's where we're starting this season of The Christian Skeptic, a 7-part series where we explore and unpack the deeper themes in each book. Today, we're discussing the creation of the world, the nature of evil and its presence in Narnia and in our own world, and most importantly, how the boy who decided God didn't exist became the man who wrote a story where God weeps. If you're new here, I hope you'll stick around. This is The Christian Skeptic. Let's get to it. Welcome to The Christian Skeptic, Aaron. Aaron and your pink hat.
It's not pink.
All three of us are here together. What are we doing? So you're doing this sermon series on the Chronicles of Narnia. We now teach through novels at our church instead.
It's the only way to go, man. It's the only way to go. When you're a Christian skeptic and you've deconstructed and you're an antinomian, it's the only way to go. No, years ago I taught through one of the most influential books I've ever read, which was also a novel. It was a really robust, admitted by the author, allegory called The Pilgrim's Progress, which most people have heard of. Even if you're not a Christian, you've heard of The Pilgrim's Progress. It's written by John Bunyan in Bedford jail, so in a jail cell for his kids who he was estranged from, loved very much, but was estranged from because of his imprisonment for preaching the gospel. And so he wrote that. It was published in 1678. It was published just originally in like these rough leather-bound copies. And then over time, it gained such traction and became so famous that there's all these like rich Victorian bindings and limited editions. Anyway, so I collect those. I'm a collector by nature. I collect Pilgrim's Progress, decided to preach through that, did a 12-part series on that years ago. And obviously, as a Christian and as a theologically conservative Christian, I centered it in the text, which Spurgeon, who came after Bunyan, he said if you'd cut John Bunyan, he would bleed scripture. So basically, it was very easy to do. Like you went to Pilgrim's Progress, and step by step from the city of destruction to the celestial city, there was this, grand sweeping Christian life narrative of redemption and sanctification and despair and doubt and so forth. And so that was probably, 6 years ago now that I did that. And so I've had the idea for the last 2 or 3 years to do the same thing with the other, I would call it allegory, Lewis himself, C.S. Lewis, who was, most people are familiar with him. He was a Christian apologist. He was a linguist. He was a contemporary and very close friend with J.R.R. Tolkien. He was a Oxford and Cambridge professor at Magdalen College. But anyway, he wrote Screwtape Letters, which was one of my favorite books ever written, a satirical approach to understanding cosmic warfare and what's going on in temptation in the life of Christians. And he also wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, which has been made famous, especially through The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, through film. And I thought, man, it would be really cool because it's incredibly redemptive. He wrote this after he had become a Christian, from atheism to Christianity. He wrote it as an apologist, but he really wrote it originally, at least book 1 in the series, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, not chronologically, but the first written and published, for his goddaughter, Lucy Barfield, to help her kind of understand the motif of redemption that we see in society, that we see in the sciences, that we see clearly in literature and in fantasy and in fairy tale, but that we see vividly in scripture and in the person of Christ. And so what I did is I kind of set about the same thing to preach a 7-part series. So now we're kind of in the first couple of weeks of that. But I'm doing it chronologically, which I'm sure we might talk about for those who are tuning in, who are Narnia fans, and there's a big debate on the order in which the book should be read and studied and chatted about. And so that's kind of the idea. You and I were talking just a couple of days ago, and we're like, man, what would be good is, you come to Sunday mornings and you have this text in front of you, scripture text first, and then the Narnian story is serving as a complementary illustrative guide. And you can only reference it 3 or 4 times over the course of a sermon. at least with specificity and like reading text from The Magician's Nephew or the other books. And so we were like, man, what if we did a few podcasts, and they might be 10 minutes long or they might be 45 minutes long, who knows, where we unpack each book in chronological order and the theological themes in these books that Scripture would testify to that Lewis was attempting to capture. Or maybe even, like we said, that he wasn't attempting to capture, that he left open. The author's intent is always very important when we're reading a book, any piece of literature, like what is the author intended? But in a lot of these fairy tales that Tolkien himself wrote, that Lewis wrote, he called the Chronicles of Narnia not allegorical, he called them suppositional, and he held to that as a belief. But it's clearly Christian in its theme. It can be read non-Christian, like by a non-Christian, and enjoyed by a non-Christian as a great piece of literature because it has this undercurrent of redemption and rescue throughout it. Yeah. But there's so much there. There would just be, I thought it might be enjoyable, and it might be enjoyable for anybody tuning in, whether they're from our church, whether they have a Christian background, whether they're non-Christian, non-believer, whether they're a skeptic. Just Lewis himself was like the greatest Christian skeptic. I mean, he really was. He called himself the reluctant convert, the most reluctant convert in all of England. And so he had to be intellectually convinced of the claims and legitimacy of Christianity. So anyway, that's kind of a background to why we decided to take a few weeks here on the podcast and discuss and unpack these books.
Well, I think it's interesting because as a Christian, I tend to approach, I'm sure you do the same thing, whatever art you're taking in, novels, films, music, whatever it is, and not intentionally just look for redemptive themes, but you see things in there. You see all sorts of redemptive themes throughout any kind of art. But what's interesting about the Chronicles of Narnia, and, well, specifically the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis's other novels and stuff as well, even though he calls them supposition, like you said, they're so clearly tied to things he believed that were true biblically. But I feel like they're also unique because he's able to portray the theological points he wants to make, the truths he's trying to get across in ways that his other nonfiction works do get across, but maybe not even as well. Like, I mean, he was writing Mere Christianity at the same time as he was doing The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, and it covers a lot of the same material, but obviously Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe is telling it in the story setting, and he even said that one of his goals with this series of books was to get past the religious dragons, his phrase, to get past the guards of religious trappings and cliche to kind of like the heart of it. And having read Mere Christianity and some of those books and read these books so many times, I feel like the truth often lands with a lot more of an emotional impact for sure from these books than maybe his nonfiction works.
And for those who are like tuning in, I highly recommend the Space Trilogy as well. Like it really deals with the issues of morality. It's very, very interesting how he, from all three of those books, how he approached things and sought to portray truth through, once again, like a fictional format. But the Chronicles of Narnia were written on a child's level, but they're certainly not just children's books. I mean, they are books that are moving people of all generations. And so once again, there's two ways to take this. The published order, the publication order was he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He was never planning on writing other pieces of fiction to go along with it to tag into this. Then he wrote Prince Caspian, then The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, then The Iron Chair. Then he wrote The Horse and His Boy, which we'll get to in a couple weeks here. And then one of his good friends, who was a professor as well at Oxford, who was instrumental in him writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, challenged him on, where does the lampstand come from in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Like, and Lewis was like, I don't have an explanation for that. Like, I have no reason for why it should be there. And so what Lewis did is he sat down. Well, actually, what a lot of people don't realize is he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think in 1948. He started writing The Magician's Nephew in 1949. So it was the second book he started. It was the last book that he finished. He did not finish it until 1954. So he wrote all the other Chronicles of Narnia while he was trying to tie all the plot holes together of The Magician's Nephew. And The Magician's Nephew became an autobiographical sketch of Lewis. A lot of people don't realize that either. He's Digory in the story. He has a mother
and all that.
Yeah, his mother was very ill. His own battles of faith, his own wrestling with the sciences, which he would call magic. And so, he wrote it, but he really labored kind of through it for 6 years until he finally finished it in 1954. So the last one finished. It was the 6th one published. And so a lot of people would say that you should read the books for mystery orientation in the publication order. I don't have a dog in the fight. I find it to be more easily understandable. Granted, it does take the mystery out of Lucy stepping through the wardrobe into Narnia and what Narnia is if you read them chronologically. But I prefer, especially for children, that they be read and unpacked chronologically. I know that makes me not a purist. I'm fine with that. But so anyway, so we're going to kind of walk through them chronologically and start with The Magician's Nephew.
Yeah, and so this first episode will be some kind of just intro, like we've already been doing, and then diving into The Magician's Nephew specifically. And one of the points you mentioned was something I want to dig into, was how this one was the most autobiographical of the series. And there's just a number of interesting theological things in here because it's dealing with the creation of the world. And you just think about, again, you mentioned the dates when this was written. Like, we're very close after World War II, Hiroshima, and the way he depicts Charn, the land, and this dying world. And I mean, there's certainly even political themes in here beyond just, Christian theological themes. But so we've got the creation of the world. Do you think, and maybe we can just start there, do you think that this book is kind of Lewis's attempt at retelling Genesis, in his own way? Or do you think that is just maybe tangential? It wasn't his goal, but it ended up dealing with creation because that's the topic that he's discussing, is the beginning of the world.
Yeah. So anybody who's listened to me talk, or you for that matter, really, I think we both agree on this, is that the cross, which is the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that moment in redemptive history is the most vivid and clear, historically accurate moment in history that we get such a legitimate picture of. So the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe captures that moment. But the cross of Christ and everything that predates, the further you go forward from or backward from the cross, the cloudier it gets. So the cloudiest moments in history are the end of time, the end of the world, and the beginning of time, which will be the last battle and the Magician's Nephew in the book series. So I don't know if Lewis was necessarily trying to capture, hey, this is the Genesis account per se. He certainly doesn't give us, I don't think, any inclination of where he stood on young Earth versus old Earth versus, like there's none of that. I mean, that's kind of the spirit of mere Christianity too, is I'll leave that to like the weightier scholars and theologians of the world. I'm just going to touch on like what's essential here. And that is that Aslan, the son, by decree of the emperor beyond the sea, breathed or sang this world into existence. And so I really think that that's what it was. Obviously, there's themes of Genesis here. There's themes of John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God. And, the Hebrews chapter 1, which was the text we took, where by the Son, the Father created the world. And so I think it's a fair question, a good question, but I don't know. I don't think that Lewis was attempting to portray anything more than that the created order had a creator behind it, and that creator is personal and compassionate.
Yeah, he wasn't trying to defend a particular worldview with the story. There's a number of things that are really interesting, though, and this is he does this through all the books, that sometimes you don't know whether he is trying to make a point or whether he is kind of accidentally maybe making a point, and that wasn't really the thing that he was after. A couple things about this book, like theologically, dealing with the problem of evil and sin. It's interesting that in this world that the evil was already there before the humans got there. So something like that, do you think that he was making a point about the nature of sin and evil there, or that is just the way he chose to tell the story, and going that far with it is maybe reading more into it than he's trying to say?
No, I think that Lewis was clearly far more intellectual than you or I or most people that we would encounter today. And so I think that much of the stuff that we would draw and see, he had intent behind. I don't think hardly anything was just haphazard. He is telling a story, and it is a fairy tale. But when he says to Lucy Barfield in his dedication to her in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book in the series, that one day you'll be old enough to read fairy tales again, he's saying there's a lot of intent behind these stories. Well, that's essentially what he's saying is the older you get, the more you'll realize that these stories, these tales, these narratives that we hear that are so rich and colorful and beautiful and moving, they're rich and colorful and beautiful and moving because there's truth being portrayed in them. And so I think that he wasn't trying to capture every theological entity in reality. Doug Wilson makes that point in a lecture he gave on The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe. But it's amazing that he captures as much as he did. And I think that the reality that evil predates the creation of Narnia is purposeful on the part of Lewis. That the deplorable word that he does not mention, but basically I think what he's doing is he's capturing the essence of the snake tempting Eve in the garden, and her falling, so the power of the tongue, that scripture says there's life and death in the power of the tongue. He's capturing all of that in the deplorable word, which is what blew apart, like the atom bomb did in Hiroshima. It's what blew apart the world of Charn. And so that predates. And just so we're clear, in case somebody's unfamiliar with the story, there's two little children, Digory and Polly, and they encounter each other, neighbors, they encounter each other. Digory's mom is really sick. He's trying to look for a cure for her. Digory's uncle, Andrew, is a crooked magician. And that's something also that's important to note, is that Lewis believed the sciences had become extremely corrupt in the mid-20th century. And that one of the reasons they're corrupt is that Lewis believed they were looking for external realities as the pivotal primary objective to determine what truth is. And he believed that the primary understanding, this goes back to what's called, and this is a little deep, but this goes back to what he called the ontological argument that convinced him of Christianity, and that is that the reality that anything exists instead of nothing is proof of the existence of God. But he would say that the greatest primary truth teller or discovery of truth is found within, and that's part of the lamppost. That's part of the analogy of the lamppost, is that the lamppost is meant to be a beacon of that there's a portal that looks more within than without. And he talks about that a little bit, and I won't get into I'm probably butchering it. I won't get into full detail about it, but basically he's saying that the lamppost is meant to stand as a representative of who we are. And while light shines out, the hope and truth of it is that it brings people to them. It's an internal reality. And so he had a issue with magicians, and so he paints magicians or scientists in a negative light. But Uncle Andrew has these rings that transport the kids into this portal of a world where there's all these different pools. And when they step into each pool, they go to a different place. And so in one of the pools, they go to Charn, which is where Jadis, the White Witch, if you've seen Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, might be familiar, she's there, but the whole world is just absolutely decayed. It's destroyed. It's despicable. And she explains to them, when Digory is tempted, rings a bell, wakes her up, she explains to them that she ruined it all by the deplorable word, which never tells us what that is, but that by something that she said, she conquered all her adversaries. She dispelled any, enemies, be they good or bad, that came against her, and she herself is wicked, and she is very powerful. And so I think that Lewis is saying, hey, evil predates creation. We see that with Lucifer in the fall, who she is an archetype of, and B, that it is not all the external factors that are it's something as small as the tongue that brings about this colossal devastation in the world, which then he juxtaposes to Aslan bringing about all life and miracles by the power of the tongue through song.
Yeah.
When you stop to think about that question, a lot of people wouldn't think about that evil predated creation, like the fall predated creation. And so it wasn't that Aslan was unaware. When he shows up, it's not that he's surprised by Jadis. He is very, very aware of who Jadis is. He is the thing. The thing that's interesting to me that a lot of people don't realize is Aslan is not a lion in all worlds. So if you went to Charn, he is different in Charn. He manifests himself as a lion in Narnia, right? He even says to Lucy, I think it's in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, or else it's Prince Caspian, that you'll encounter me in your world, but there I go by a different name, which is the name of Jesus. And there, you've known me here a little bit, but you'll know me there far better. And so in our world, obviously this world of legitimacy and reality as we understand it, it's Jesus. But in every world, so in Charn, he would have been something very different. In each of those pools, he would have manifested. That's not to say that that just so anybody who's listening is tracking, that's not to say that Allah is God and Buddha is God. We're not saying that. We're not polytheist. I'm just saying, according to the fairy tale script, the emperor beyond the sea sends his son manifesting himself in Narnia as the lion, which you actually hear Bree talk about in the Horse and His Boy later on.
I was going to say the Horse and His Boy will definitely lend itself to some discussion about those very issues, Aslan showing up in different forms and under different names and things like that. But real quick before leaving Uncle Andrew, I think it seems clear that he was kind of portraying the skeptical scientist there with all the answers who clearly got it all wrong. But he portrays Uncle Andrew as sort of like, he's kind of an idiot. He's kind of a bumbling fool, you know? And as you said, Lewis himself was a staunch atheist for many years. Also, I didn't say this in the intro, but a lot of the things we've been talking about on this show and in our communities lately, I mean, it followed a very similar path with him. He was Digory. He was the 9-year-old boy who, you know, prayed for his mother and she died anyway. And then he was angry and decided that either God didn't exist or he was evil. And so, you know, he became an atheist for much of his life and then converted to Christianity after being convinced by his assessment and search of the evidence. And so, given all that, do you think his portrayal of Uncle Andrew is more caricature than accurate?
I think there is a caricature there that he's portraying, but I think he's getting at the idea of like what Scripture talks about, that the fools said in their heart there is no God. We have it all figured out. Yeah. What I can see and what I can put my hands on and what I can create is what's actually substantive and what matters most, and anything else is far-fetched and ludicrous. And you see that even when Uncle Andrew gets to Narnia. And he just can't accept reality as it is because it doesn't fit the pyramid of his way of thinking. And so I do think it's a caricature, but I think that he's capturing what he believed of the sciences and of the scholastic and intellectual of his day who were God deniers, like the Bertrand Russells of the world, for example, who were speaking in his day.
Well, even like the fact that Uncle Andrew could not, it just, Aslan's voice sounded like a lion roaring to him. Like he couldn't understand the words. Understand him, So like Lewis is making the point that even the ability to comprehend, like we're getting into soteriology here a little bit, but the ability to even comprehend God's voice or Aslan's voice is itself the measure of God's grace toward us. And you might have thoughts on that, but that's one of the things I love so much about these books is it's just every single page, every single scene, he's able to pack so much theology into, on the surface, what seems like a very simple story. And and I love these books for that reason. There's just little things like that all through it.
Yeah, the deeper you dive, definitely the more you see. Yeah. When you start just kind of chewing up each paragraph or every couple paragraphs, and you start going, wow, like he's actually conveying something there, and it probably very purposefully with intention.
Yeah.
And if he's not, he's still unintentionally conveying something there.
Yeah. Well, I only have a couple more points on this book, or questions, I guess. Sure. But one of the things is we've talked about this being autobiographical. So that scene, and you did in your sermon on Sunday, you quoted probably, it's one of my favorite scenes of the entire series, when Digory is crying over his mother and Aslan is there, and Lewis has that line where Digory realizes that Aslan actually is more sorry about his mother than he is himself, which is always a deeply moving thing. Like I'm moved every single time I read that. And so, given Lewis's history, which we just talked about a little bit, is he trying to make the point that Jesus is actually there with us in those moments and cares about what's going on? Like, is he kind of giving Digory the happy ending that he didn't get in real life? Or is he making a theological point here?
I think he's making a theological point that is true. Like, you see Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, even though he knows they're reprobate. He knows they're going to crucify him in a matter of a week or less than a week, but he's still weeping. How often I've longed to gather you like a mother hen would gather his chicks, but you were not willing to do so. Now that conflicts with other avenues and aspects of theology that we know to be true about the sovereignty of God, and about that just because there is, I mean, like like another reference is like John 11, where Jesus weeps at the tomb of Lazarus, right? But yet he weeps knowing that in just like a matter of of 90 seconds, Lazarus will be walking back out of that tomb. So there is the supremacy of God, which, by the way, I mentioned this in my sermon, but I'll reference again. There's different aspects. One of them is when Jadis, the White Witch, who was stronger than all the humans, throws the lampstand off of Aslan's face, and it just literally bounces off, and he keeps on coming, and she runs screaming for the hills. Like that kind of like supremacy that Lewis speaks about. He keeps talking about like Aslan. He says in almost all the books that nothing is more beautiful or fierce. You know, like he'll use that type of phraseology. Like when you look at Aslan, nothing is more beautiful, but also nothing is more fierce. It's just a great way of capturing the essence of he is incredibly compassionate and merciful and loving and gracious and cares about what breaks our heart and cares about the destructive elements of sin upon the world. And so you have a very John 11:35 Jesus wept type moment there with Digory, where the lion's eyes are filled with tears, and he cares about the effects that sin has had upon the world and what it's doing to Digory's mother and what it did to Lewis's mother, because that's like the effects cosmically of original sin upon the world. And so I think that is very true. And I think that Lewis captures that well. And that is like one of those kind of moments where you're like, you are moved as you're reading the book. I mean, the whole creation account, which I thought it would be boring if I just sat here and read passages of the book on the podcast. But the whole creation account of they start hearing in the darkness. They show up in Narnia after trying to escape our world. So they go from Charn to our world. It's a disaster. So then they try to escape our world and leave the witch behind, but then they pull her into this dark void of a place that happens to be Narnia. And as they're there and as they're discussing, they start hearing this voice singing. And they can't make out the words, but it's such a beautiful and rich and melodious song. And the stars start bursting by the thousands into the sky, and creatures began to burst into being and sing along with it. And it's just like a very like moving moment. And then they see the lion himself, the creator, and everything else, all the other beauty kind of like fades, it dissipates. And so there's all this like supremacy speech, you know, that he is magnificent, that he is, you know, but then there's like this compassion you talked about. There's compassion on like, you have like this seemingly uneducated, backwards cabby in the book who gets swept into Narnia by accident, quote, so to speak, him and his horse, and Strawberry, and Aslan by grace only. So there's redemptive themes even from the beginning. By grace only, Aslan mates the cabby, which is not like a prestigious job in London in the 1950s, but he mates the cabby,
the king,
the king of Narnia, the first king of Narnia. He's like, can I have my wife here? Can I have my boo? And he's like, sure. So he goes and gets her, and they become the first king and queen of Narnia. That's just grace, right? And then he sends Digory kind of test him on a mission against Jadis, and Digory overcomes temptation really out of love for Polly, and then he gives Digory this apple core that heals his mother, and then ultimately becomes a tree, the core of it, that becomes blown down by a storm and is formed into the wardrobe that the Pavinzi children go through like 50 years later. But there's like such redemptive aspects. Even the lampstand itself, if somebody's read the book, they know this, but in the book, she breaks off a piece of the lampstand while she's in London, in our world, and hits the police officer on the head with it. She uses it as a weapon. And then she kind of is hurled with it and then hurls it into Narnia at Aslan. So it's meant to be an object of destruction, and yet Aslan makes it a display of redemption and hope. You know, so there's even in this creative order, I mean, it's kind of those echoes of Genesis 3:15, what's called the first gospel, the proto-evangelion, that a seed, one from the woman will come, the serpent will strike his heel, but he will crush the serpent's head. Like that's the first kind of gospel good news proclamation that evil will be dealt with. And so you have those hints and whispers all throughout the back half of The Magician's Nephew.
And I love that these books are written. I feel like this story specifically feels like one of the more childlike, I don't know if that's the right word, of the seven.
Well, it's almost like you almost feel like Lewis wishes he could reach back to his 9-year-old self and say, Jesus cares more about your mother even than you do. You know, and so he is writing, I would agree. I think it's like, whereas The Horse and His Boy is like very adult. Even though it's about children, it's very adult. And how you would understand it. The Magician's Nephew has like a simple beauty to it that I think was because he was writing it from the perspective of what he went through in adolescence. Yeah, there is a kind of just a honest beauty to it that speaks to kind of even the youngest of souls.
Yeah, and what I love about that is that a child can read this story and they might not pick up on all the theological themes, but they can understand the idea that Aslan is grieving with Digory. God grieves with you. This isn't a treatise on the problem of evil in the world and the problem of suffering. The same way we talked about creation, like he's not so much concerned with explaining the mechanisms and the days and the years and all that, but more the creation being sung into existence and him saying, I give all of this to you. I give myself to you. And so a kid can read that and feel that. And then as an adult, we go back and read it and we see everything that's just under the surface, and it's so impactful. And I also, this is the last thing, and we'll see this through all the books in the series, but I love how Lewis is able to capture in Aslan, or just in the whole worldview, things that the church has historically gotten wrong or perverted. Yeah. When we started the show back in the beginning, it was about understanding truth rather than tradition. And so historically, the church has tried to tame and domesticate Jesus because that is easier to package and to sell and to create programs around for lots of reasons. And you're constantly confronted. You mentioned this a few minutes ago, I think, but you're constantly confronted through these books with the dichotomies, the not safe but good, the grieving with you there, but also able to sing this whole creation into existence.
He's a wild lion.
He shows all these aspects. Yeah.
You hear that over and over. He's a wild lion. One of the things I think that people will miss is, one, I don't know if Lewis intended this, but when Digory rides Strawberry and Polly goes with him to confront Jadis at the behest of Aslan, Jadis then offers him healing for his mother. But it would be at the forfeiture of Polly. It would basically be the forfeiture of everything that's good. But yet he would be able to go back to his land, put his ring on, go back to his land, and his mother would be healed. And I think what Lewis is capturing there, inadvertently or purposefully, is that that's the reverse order of the fall. That if Adam and Eve had been able to stand against temptation, like Digory does in the book, then Aslan would have rewarded them with immortality, which is what he gives. He doesn't give immortality to the mother, but she's healed and lives on to seemingly an old age. And so there's like a reverse order of when we understand, like, because it does kind of, and there's an undercurrent of dealing with the problem of evil in the world. Like, we gave in, and we can say Adam and Eve did, but we have also given in to the power and seduction of temptation and brought about the catastrophe upon the world that now leads to sickness and decay and death. And so, and if we had not, and all humanity before us had not, then there would be life and immortality. So that's another theme I think that Lewis is pointing toward, is the what could have been. Now, granted, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is so beautiful and so deep that it showcases the love of God through redemption, which would not be necessary had the fall and temptation and succumbing to temptation not taken place. But still, the reality is that redemption would not have been necessary had the fall not occurred in the first place. Had we not fallen into temptation, there wouldn't be the destruction and the decay. So, which actually leads to an interesting conversation we might have on the next podcast, and that is how did Narnia fall under the curse of the White Witch after this time period? 1,000 years later, Jadis is still there. The cabby and his wife are long gone, and now it's always winter, never Christmas, and we'll get into that next week.
That sets up the next episode, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's a quote from this book where they're talking about evil, and Aslan says something like, greater evil will come from that evil, but I'll see to it that the worst of the evil lands upon myself. And then that leads us right into The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where that's exactly what happens, that evil does fall upon himself. So we'll talk about that one next time.
Yep, sounds good.